I found out that my stepsister was bleeding my dying mother dry. So I destroyed her imaginary career. My mother Diane got diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer 2 years ago, and the chemo made her weak and confused sometimes. My stepfather Paul had married her 10 years ago and brought along his daughter Kylie, who was 28 and supposedly a life coach, but really just posted motivational quotes online and lived off whoever would support her. When Diane got sick, I moved back home to help with treatments and medications while working my nursing job at night. Paul had died 5 years earlier from a heart attack, so it was just me, Diane, and Kylie in the house, except Kylie was never around unless she needed something. She'd show up once a month for rent money because she couldn't afford her apartment downtown, even though she had 3 roommates. Diane always gave it to her because Kylie would cry about being Paul's only daughter and how he would want Diane to take care of her. I noticed Diane's bank statements showing weird withdrawals every few days. 50 here, 100 there, sometimes 300 at once. When I asked Diane about it, she got confused and said she didn't remember. The chemo was affecting her memory, but not that badly. I checked her purse and found receipts for cash withdrawals from ATMs near Kylie's apartment. That's when I installed a camera in Diane's room without telling anyone. The footage showed Kylie visiting while I was at work, sitting with Diane for 5 minutes, then going through her wallet. She'd take Diane's debit card and leave for an hour, then come back and slip it into Diane's purse. She'd kiss Diane's forehead and say she loved her, then leave with shopping bags. Kylie was literally robbing my cancer-stricken mother while pretending to be a caring daughter. The next time Kylie came over while I was home, she put on this big show about being worried about Diane's health. She cried about losing another parent and hugged Diane, who could barely hug back because she was so weak from treatment. Then Kylie mentioned her car needed repairs, and she didn't know how she'd get to her life coaching clients. Diane immediately offered to help, and Kylie acted surprised like she hadn't planned this whole performance. I watched Kylie take $800 from Diane's wallet, while Diane dozed off from her pain medication. Over the next month, I tracked everything. Kylie had taken $12,000 in 6 months. She'd bought designer bags, gotten lip fillers, took a vacation to Miami with her boyfriend Chase, all while my mother was rationing her pain medication because she thought she couldn't afford more. Kylie posted constantly about manifesting abundance and attracting wealth through positive thinking, while she was stealing from a woman going through chemotherapy. Her boyfriend Chase commented on every post about what an inspiration she was and how lucky he was to have such a spiritual goddess. He had no idea his goddess was a thief. I started my plan by befriending Chase at the gym where he worked as a trainer. I pretended I didn't know who he was and hired him for sessions. Chase was 26 and dumb as a brick, but sweet in that golden retriever way. He talked constantly about his amazing girlfriend who was building an empire. He showed me her Instagram where she had 4,000 followers buying her $30 meditation guides that were just copied from free websites. Chase believed Kylie was a successful entrepreneur who was too evolved for regular work. After a few weeks, I mentioned my stepsister was also a life coach and showed him a photo. Chase got excited about connecting them until he realized it was Kylie. I acted shocked that we were connected. Chase started asking questions about our family, and I mentioned my mother's cancer. He went quiet and said Kylie told him her stepmother was wealthy and funded her business ventures. I said Diane was on disability and Medicare and showed him photos of her in the hospital. Chase looked sick. The next session, Chase mentioned Kylie had asked him for money for a coaching certification program that cost $5,000. He'd been saving for a car, but Kylie said investing in her business was investing in their future. I suggested he should see her business records first, since that's what smart investors do. Chase had never thought to ask because he trusted her. He started asking Kylie about profit margins and tax returns. She got defensive and said he didn't support her dreams. That weekend, Kylie came to take money from Diane again, but I'd moved the cash from Diane's wallet. Kylie searched everywhere, getting increasingly frantic. She woke Diane up, demanding to know where her money was. Diane was confused and scared. Kylie actually shook her, asking about the ATM card. I walked in and asked what was happening. Kylie said Diane had promised her money for rent but forgot where she put it. I said Diane's doctor mentioned she shouldn't make financial decisions during treatment because the medication affected judgment. Kylie stormed out, saying we were controlling Diane's money and she'd get a lawyer. She went straight to Chase and demanded he give her the $5,000 immediately. Chase asked to see her business plan first. Kylie exploded. My phone buzzed around 11 that night while I was doing Diane's evening medications. Chase's name lit up the screen with a text that was way longer than his usual messages. He said Kylie had called him screaming for over an hour after their restaurant fight, telling him he was just like everyone else who never believed in her vision. She accused him of trying to sabotage her business dreams and said he was holding her back from her full potential. Chase wrote that his hands were shaking while she yelled, and he didn't know what to think anymore. He asked if we could meet tomorrow to talk more about what I'd said regarding Diane's actual money situation. I texted back that we could meet at the coffee shop near his gym around 2 in the afternoon. Sitting there in Diane's dim bedroom with my phone glowing, I felt this weird mix of satisfaction that my plan was working exactly how I wanted and guilt about using someone as genuinely nice as Chase. He didn't deserve to be a tool in my revenge scheme, but Kylie had made him one the second she started lying to him about where her money came from. The next afternoon, I got to the coffee shop 15 minutes early and ordered a regular coffee. Nothing fancy. Chase walked in looking like he'd been hit by a truck. His eyes had dark circles under them, and his gym shirt was wrinkled like he'd slept in it. He dropped into the chair across from me and rubbed his face with both hands. He said he barely slept last night because he kept thinking about the differences between what Kylie told him and what I'd shown him about Diane's cancer. His voice was rough and tired. He pulled out his phone and showed me a string of texts from Kylie that must have been 20 messages long. She was demanding he prove his commitment to their relationship by giving her the $5,000 right now without asking any more questions. The texts got more desperate as they went on, saying if he really loved her, he would trust her and support her dreams. I watched Chase's face while he scrolled through them and saw him struggling with wanting to believe the woman he loved while facing all this. Evidence that she'd been lying to him about everything. I made a choice right then to show him more proof. I pulled up my phone and opened the photos I'd taken of Diane's actual living situation over the past few weeks. The first one showed our modest living room with the hospital bed we'd set up because Diane couldn't climb stairs anymore. The second showed her bathroom counter covered in pill organizers with different medications for different times of day. The third was the kitchen table stacked with hospital bills and insurance statements. The last one was Diane sleeping in her chair, looking so thin and pale that you could see her skull shape through her skin. Chase stared at each photo for a long time without saying anything. Finally, he asked quietly why Kylie would lie about Diane being wealthy if this was the real situation. His voice cracked a little on the question. I told him gently that I'd been asking myself the same thing for weeks while watching my mother's bank account get drained dry. I said I didn't understand how someone could look at a dying woman and see a source of money instead of a person who needed help. Chase put his phone down on the table and started talking about what Kylie had told him about her childhood and family. He said she'd told him she grew up in this big house with expensive things and that Diane had plenty of money from Paul's life insurance. Kylie claimed that Diane had promised to fund her business ventures because that's what Paul would have wanted for his only daughter. Chase believed Kylie was entitled to family money to build her entrepreneurial empire and that Diane was being generous by investing in her stepdaughter's future. He'd never questioned any of it because Kylie seemed so confident and successful with her Instagram following and her meditation guides. Watching him realize he'd been fed a completely made-up story was hard to see. His face went through confusion first, then hurt, then this growing anger that made his jaw clench. He said he felt like an idiot for believing everything without ever asking for proof. I told him he wasn't an idiot. He was just a trusting person who got taken advantage of by someone who was really good at lying. I suggested carefully that maybe he should find out exactly where his girlfriend's money actually came from before he handed over his car savings. I said smart investors always look at business records and financial statements before putting money into something. Chase nodded slowly and said he was going to tell Kylie he needed to see her business financial records and tax returns before investing such a large amount in her certification program. He said it firmly, like he was trying to convince himself he could actually do it. I felt this surge of satisfaction knowing Kylie couldn't possibly produce real documents for a business that didn't actually exist. She'd been copying free meditation guides from websites and selling them for $30 while pretending she had this successful coaching empire. There was no way she had legitimate tax returns or profit and loss statements that would hold up to any real scrutiny. Over the next 3 days, Chase kept me updated through texts about what was happening with Kylie. He said she was avoiding all his questions about business documentation and instead sending him these long emotional texts about trust and partnership. One minute she'd be telling him how much she loved him and how they were building a future together. The next minute she'd be guilt-tripping him about not believing in her vision and not being supportive of her dreams. He sent me screenshots of her messages and I could see the manipulation tactics so clearly now that I knew what to look for. She was alternating between making him feel special and making him feel guilty, never actually answering his questions about the business records. Chase said he was starting to see the patterns of how she'd been controlling him for months. Every time he'd asked a reasonable question, she'd made it about his lack of faith in her instead of about the actual facts. I spent those same 3 days going through all the camera footage from Diane's room in a systematic way. I created this detailed timeline spreadsheet with every single theft listed by date, time, and amount taken. Marlene came over to help me organize everything into a clear presentation that someone could look at and immediately understand what had been happening. We put timestamps on each video clip and matched them to the ATM withdrawals from Diane's bank statements. Her husband Arthur stopped by after his shift and reviewed everything with his retired cop eyes. He sat at our kitchen table scrolling through the evidence for almost an hour without saying much. Finally, he looked up and said, "This was definitely elder financial abuse under state law and possibly criminal theft, depending on how the prosecutor wanted to handle it." He said I needed to decide soon whether I wanted to involve the police and press charges or try to handle it privately within the family. Arthur warned me that once I reported it to authorities, I couldn't control what happened next. The legal system would take over, and Kylie could end up with a criminal record that would follow her forever. Diane had a really bad reaction to her latest chemo treatment that week. She spent 2 whole days barely conscious and in significant pain that her regular medications couldn't touch. I was running on maybe 3 hours of sleep total, trying to take care of her around the clock while also working my nursing shifts at night. My supervisor had been understanding about me calling out a few times, but I knew I was pushing the limit of how much flexibility they could give me. During one of Diane's brief moments of being awake and aware, she looked at me with these cloudy eyes and asked weakly if Kylie had visited recently. Her voice was so soft I had to lean in close to hear her. I stood there holding her hand and had to decide right then whether to tell her the truth about what I'd discovered or keep protecting her from more pain. She was already suffering so much physically. Did she need the emotional trauma of knowing her stepdaughter had been robbing her while she was too weak to notice? I chose to wait until Diane was stronger before telling her about Kylie's theft. She didn't need that emotional weight added on top of everything her body was already fighting. But I did mention quietly that I'd taken over managing her finances to make things easier during her treatment. I said it would be one less thing for her to worry about, and I'd handle all the bills and banking from now on. Diane's face relaxed when I said that, and she squeezed my hand with what little strength she had. She whispered thank you for taking care of everything, and said she didn't know what she'd do without me. The trust in her voice made me feel both protective and angry. She trusted people so easily, and Kylie had used that trust to steal from her for months. I smoothed Diane's hair back from her forehead, and promised her I'd make sure everything was handled properly. Chase finally confronted Kylie directly about the business records during what he thought would be a normal dinner date on Saturday night. He texted me around 9 that evening while I was giving Diane her nighttime medications. The message said Kylie had a complete meltdown in the restaurant when he asked to see her financial documentation. She started crying loudly enough that other diners were staring at their table. She accused him of being just like everyone else in her life who never believed in her or supported her dreams. When Chase stayed firm about needing to see actual business records and tax returns before investing $5,000, Kylie stood up and told him he was killing her spirit. She grabbed her purse and stormed out of the restaurant, leaving him sitting there with 2 full plates of food and everyone watching. Chase said he'd tried calling her multiple times, but she wasn't answering, and had turned off her location sharing on her phone. He said he'd been sitting in his car in the restaurant parking lot for the past hour trying to figure out what to do next. I could feel the confusion and hurt coming through his texts, even though he was trying to sound calm about it. I told Chase I'd call him back and texted Marlene immediately. My hands were shaking as I typed out the message about what just happened with Chase and how Kylie was falling apart. Marlene responded within seconds, saying she'd be over in 15 minutes. I went back to check on Diane, who was sleeping peacefully after her evening medications, completely unaware of the chaos surrounding her finances. The doorbell rang 3 days later while I was crushing Diane's pills into applesauce, so she could swallow them easier. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my stomach dropped when I looked through the window and saw Kylie standing on the porch. Her makeup was smeared down her cheeks like she'd been crying for hours, and her hair was pulled back in a messy knot. She was wearing sweatpants and an oversized hoodie instead of her usual carefully styled outfits for Instagram. I opened the door but stood in the doorway blocking her from coming inside. Kylie's eyes were red and puffy, and she looked desperate in a way I'd never seen before. She asked if she could please speak with Diane privately about some important family matters. Her voice cracked when she said it, and she kept glancing past me into the house like she was trying to see where Diane was. I told her calmly that Diane wasn't well enough for visitors right now and needed to rest. Kylie's face twisted, and she said she just needed 5 minutes to talk to Diane about something urgent. I could see the panic in her eyes as she realized I was cutting off her access to her cash source. She tried to push past me, but I held my ground and told her she needed to leave. Kylie stepped back onto the porch, and her whole demeanor changed from desperate to angry. She started accusing me of poisoning Diane against her and controlling the family finances in ways that weren't appropriate. Her voice got louder, and I stayed eerily calm, which seemed to make her more frantic. I asked her directly how much money she thought was appropriate to take from a woman undergoing chemotherapy. Kylie stumbled over her words, trying to reframe everything as loans that Diane had approved and understood. She said Diane wanted to help her and that Paul would have wanted his daughter taken care of. I watched her panic rising as she realized I knew exactly what she'd been doing. She tried to say the withdrawals were confusing because of Diane's medications, and maybe there were some misunderstandings about amounts. I told Kylie clearly that I had documentation of every single unauthorized withdrawal she'd made over the past 6 months. Her face went pale, and she asked what I meant by documentation. I said I had bank statements, ATM receipts, and camera footage showing her taking Diane's debit card while Diane was unconscious from pain medication. Kylie started backing away from the door and threatened to get a lawyer because I was financially abusing Diane by restricting her access to her own money. I responded that I welcomed any legal scrutiny of who had actually been taking money from Diane's account. I watched her face go from angry to scared as she realized that threat worked both ways. She said she'd be back with a lawyer to sort this out properly and stormed off to her car. I closed the door and locked it and immediately started shaking with adrenaline and anger. My whole body felt like it was vibrating, and I had to sit down on the kitchen floor to calm down. I texted Marlene again, and she showed up within 20 minutes, finding me still sitting there trying to breathe normally. Marlene sat down on the floor next to me and reminded me that I was doing the right thing protecting Diane. She said I needed to be strategic about next steps instead of just reacting to whatever Kylie did next. We talked about getting an actual attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases, because this was beyond what I could handle on my own. Marlene helped me stand up and make tea while we looked up lawyers in the area. That evening, Chase called me sounding exhausted and confused. He said Kylie had finally responded to all his messages with this long explanation about how Diane's illness had made her act irrationally about money. She was claiming she'd borrowed funds with Diane's permission, but got confused about the amounts because she was so stressed about potentially losing another parent. Chase asked me point blank if I thought Kylie was lying to him about everything. I told him honestly that I had video evidence of her taking money while Diane was completely unconscious and unable to give any kind of permission. The silence on the other end of the call lasted so long I thought he'd hung up. Then he said he needed some time to think and ended the call. 2 days later, I met with Nadine Ward at her office downtown. I brought all my documentation in a folder including printed bank statements, the ATM receipts I'd found, and the camera footage on a flash drive. Nadine was probably in her 50s with short gray hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She reviewed everything methodically without saying much while I sat across from her desk feeling anxious. After about 30 minutes, she looked up and confirmed that this constituted clear elder abuse under state law. She explained I had several options ranging from demanding private restitution to filing criminal charges. Each option had different implications for family relationships and different likelihoods of actually recovering the stolen money. Nadine asked me directly what outcome I actually wanted from this situation. Did I want punishment for Kylie, recovery of the money, or just protection for Diane going forward? I realized sitting there that I hadn't fully thought through what I wanted beyond exposing what Kylie had done. After thinking for a few minutes, I told Nadine my priority was getting back as much money as possible for Diane's care. I also wanted to make sure Kylie could never access Diane's accounts again. Nadine nodded and said she could draft a formal demand letter that would outline the documented theft and require full restitution. The letter would give Kylie 30 days to pay back the $12,000 or face criminal charges and a civil lawsuit. Nadine explained this approach often worked because it gave people a chance to avoid a criminal record while making consequences very clear. I authorized her to send the letter to Kylie through certified mail so there'd be proof she received it. While waiting for Kylie to get the demand letter, I knew I had to tell Diane what was happening. I waited. For a day when she was having a good response to her treatment and seemed mentally clear. I sat beside her bed and held her hand and explained as gently as I could that I'd discovered Kylie had been taking money without permission. Diane's face just crumbled and she started crying these quiet tears that broke my heart. She said she'd trusted Kylie as Paul's daughter and couldn't believe this was happening. Watching Diane process the betrayal was harder than any of the confrontations with Kylie had been. She was mourning the loss of that relationship while also feeling guilty that she hadn't noticed what was happening. She kept saying she should have paid better attention to her accounts and that Paul would be so disappointed. I reassured her that the confusion from chemotherapy had made it impossible for her to track everything properly. I told her I was handling the situation to protect her and make sure she had money for her care. Diane asked me weekly what was going to happen to Kylie now. I was honest with her that it depended on whether Kylie took responsibility and actually returned the money she'd stolen. I told her honestly that it depended on whether Kylie took responsibility and actually returned the money she'd stolen. 3 days later, my phone buzzed at 6:30 in the morning while I was finishing my shift at the hospital. I ignored it because I was in the middle of documenting a patient's vitals, but it kept buzzing over and over. When I finally checked during my break, I had 7 missed calls from an unknown number and 3 voicemails. The first voicemail was Chase asking if we could talk. The second was him saying it was important. The third was him saying he'd wait in the parking lot until I got off work. I walked out at 7 exhausted from 12 hours on my feet and found him leaning against his truck looking like he'd been awake for days. His eyes were red and his gym clothes were wrinkled like he'd slept in them. He pushed off the truck when he saw me and asked if we could talk for a few minutes. I nodded and we walked to the far end of the parking lot away from other people leaving their shifts. Chase told me he broke up with Kylie last night after she finally admitted she'd been taking money from Diane. He said she claimed it was only a few $100s for emergencies and that Diane had given her permission. When he asked about the business certification program that cost $5,000, she broke down and admitted it didn't exist. She needed the money to cover rent and credit card debt that had piled up over the past year. Chase looked sick, telling me this like he was ashamed he'd believed her lies for so long. He said the worst part wasn't even the lying about money. It was realizing that she'd been using him the whole time as another potential source of cash when Diane's account ran dry. Kylie had tried to convince him they could work through it together if he just trusted her and gave her time to fix. But Chase couldn't get past the image of her stealing from a cancer patient who could barely stay awake long enough to realize her wallet was emptied. I felt genuine sympathy for him standing there looking broken and confused. He was a good person who got caught up with someone who saw him as a resource instead of a partner. I told him I was sorry he had to find out this way, but that he deserved better than someone who would manipulate him like that. Chase nodded and said he was moving gyms because he couldn't stand seeing the places they used to go together. Then he thanked me for opening his eyes even though it hurt, and walked back to his truck. 2 days after that conversation, Kylie received the demand letter from Nadine through certified mail. I knew she got it because my phone started ringing at 2 p.m. while I was helping Diane with her medication. Kylie's name flashed on the screen and I almost didn't answer, but I wanted to hear what she had to say. Her voice was high and frantic when I picked up asking if I was serious about the letter. She said there was no way she could pay back $12,000 and that I was being completely unreasonable. I told her coldly that she'd managed to spend it fast enough on designer bags and trips to Miami, so she needed to figure out how to return it. Kylie started crying and saying I didn't understand how hard things had been for her since Paul died. She said she'd made mistakes, but pressing charges would ruin her entire life. I felt a flicker of sympathy hearing her sob, but then I remembered the camera footage of her shaking my barely conscious mother and demanding to know where the ATM card was. I told her she had 30 days to come up with a restitution plan, or Nadine would file criminal charges. Kylie asked desperately if we could work something out as family instead of getting lawyers involved. I responded that family doesn't steal from dying relatives, and hung up while she was still begging me to reconsider. Over the next week, Kylie tried everything she could think of to get around the consequences. She sent long apologetic texts directly to Diane's phone that I intercepted before Diane could see them. The messages were full of excuses about stress and confusion and promises to be better. She had mutual acquaintances from Paul's side of the family reach out to me asking if forgiveness was possible. An older cousin called saying that Kylie was Paul's only child, and he would have wanted us to work things out privately. She even contacted the hospital trying to leave messages for me through the front desk. Each attempt felt more manipulative than the last because they were all focused on avoiding consequences instead of actually acknowledging the harm she'd caused. None of the messages mentioned Diane's suffering, or the pain medication she'd rationed because she thought she couldn't afford more. I documented every text, every voicemail, every attempt at contact, and forwarded all of it to Nadine, who added it to the case file as evidence of harassment. While Kylie was trying to manipulate her way out of trouble, Diane was getting worse. Her oncologist called me in for a meeting and explained that the cancer was progressing faster than the chemo could control it. He recommended adjusting her care plan to focus more on comfort and quality of life, instead of aggressive treatment that was making her miserable without helping much. I sat there in his office trying to process what he was really saying, which was that we were moving into the final stage. When I got home, Diane was awake and lucid enough to notice I'd been crying. She asked weakly what the doctor had said, and I had to tell her we were changing the approach to make her more comfortable. She nodded like she'd been expecting this, and squeezed my hand with what little strength she had left. Later that evening, during one of her clear moments, she asked about Kylie with this heartbroken expression that made my chest tight. She wanted to know if there was any chance of fixing things before she died. I didn't know how to answer that because part of me questioned whether pursuing justice was worth causing Diane this emotional pain during her final months. I called Marlene that night and broke down completely, telling her I didn't know if I was doing the right thing anymore. Diane was suffering emotionally from the family fracture, and I was the one who'd caused it by exposing Kylie's theft. Marlene came over within 20 minutes and sat with me in the kitchen while I cried. She reminded me that protecting Diane's remaining resources wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about making sure Diane had proper care and medication for whatever time she had left. The $12,000 Kylie stole could have paid for better pain management, home health aides to give me breaks, or treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. Marlene said I was doing exactly what a good daughter should do by making sure Diane's money went to Diane's care instead of Kylie's designer bags. That perspective helped me feel more resolved even when the guilt about the family situation tried to creep back in. The next afternoon, I got a message request on social media from someone named Keith Lucero. The profile picture showed a guy in his late 20s, and the message said he was one of Kylie's roommates. He said he felt terrible about what had been happening and wanted me to know the truth about Kylie's situation. I accepted the message, and Keith explained that Kylie had been lying to all three of her roommates about having a successful life coaching business. They'd been covering her share of rent for the past 4 months because she kept promising payment was coming from her business income. Keith said he'd overheard Kylie on the phone with someone talking about the demand letter, and that's when he realized she'd been stealing from her stepmother. He offered to testify about her spending habits and deception if it would help my case because he was angry about being used himself. I talked to Nadine about Keith's offer, and she said his testimony could be valuable because it showed a pattern of exploitation beyond just Diane. Keith sent me copies of text messages where Kylie promised to pay her share of rent as soon as her next client payment came through. The dates on the texts matched up with times when she'd taken large amounts from Diane's account. Keith also told me that Kylie owed the three roommates over $3,000 in back rent combined and had been promising payment for months. She'd apparently been juggling multiple lies to different people, creating this huge web of deception that was starting to collapse. The pattern wasn't just about stealing from Diane. It was about Kylie seeing everyone around her as resources to exploit for her fake lifestyle. The 30-day deadline was approaching fast, and Kylie still hadn't proposed any kind of payment plan. Nadine called me to say she was preparing to file criminal charges, as we'd agreed, but wanted to give me one final chance to reconsider before we crossed that line. I sat in Diane's room watching her sleep and thought about all the collateral damage my revenge had created. Chase was devastated and changing his whole life to avoid reminders of Kylie. Diane was grieving the loss of her stepdaughter during her final months. Even Kylie herself was desperate and panicking as her lies caught up with her. But then I thought about Diane rationing her pain medication because she believed she couldn't afford proper doses while Kylie was getting lip fillers and buying designer bags. I thought about the camera footage of Kylie going through Diane's wallet while she was unconscious from medication. I called Nadine back and told her to file the charges because consequences were necessary, even if they hurt. 2 days before Nadine was supposed to file criminal charges, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice asked if I was Diane's daughter, and when I said yes, she told me she was Paul's ex-wife and Kylie's mother. Her name was Sandra, and she sounded tired in a way that went beyond just being sleepy. She asked what it would take to resolve everything without involving the police. I sat down on the couch because my legs suddenly felt weak. Sandra said she'd just found out what Kylie had been doing and she was horrified by her daughter's actions. She offered to help arrange a payment plan if I would agree not to press charges. Her voice cracked when she said she understood if I refused, but she was begging me to consider it. I told her I needed to talk to my attorney first, and she said she understood completely. After we hung up, I called Nadine immediately. Nadine said it wasn't unusual for family members to try to intervene before criminal charges got filed. She asked if I wanted to hear what Sandra had to say, and I realized I did. Something about Sandra's shame felt different from Kylie's panic. Nadine suggested we meet somewhere neutral with her present to negotiate terms. I agreed and we set up a meeting for the next day at a coffee shop downtown. Sandra arrived 10 minutes early looking nervous. She was maybe 55 with gray streaks in her brown hair and lines around her eyes that suggested she'd spent years worrying. When I sat down across from her with Nadine beside me, Sandra started apologizing before I even took my coat off. She said she'd been enabling Kylie's irresponsibility for years, and she was deeply sorry that it had escalated to stealing from a sick woman. Her hands shook as she held her coffee cup. Nadine asked what Sandra was proposing, and Sandra said she would take out a personal loan to pay back half the stolen amount immediately if Kylie committed to a structured payment plan for the rest. She wanted to make amends even though legally she didn't have to do anything. I watched her face while she talked and saw genuine remorse there. Nadine pulled out a notepad and started writing down numbers. She said if we went this route, the agreement would need to be formal and legally binding with serious consequences if Kylie missed payments. Sandra nodded quickly and said she understood. We spent the next hour working out details. Nadine proposed that Sandra pay $6,000 upfront and Kylie pay $500 monthly for 12 months to cover the remaining $6,000. The agreement would include a complete ban on Kylie contacting Diane, a formal written admission of theft, and a clause stating that any missed payment would trigger immediate criminal charges. Sandra agreed to everything without hesitation. She said she'd been saving money for retirement, but this was more important. I felt strange accepting help from someone who had no responsibility for what happened, but Nadine reminded me quietly that recovering money for Diane's care was the priority. Sandra signed the preliminary agreement right there and promised to have the $6,000 ready within 3 days. The formal signing happened at Nadine's office a week later. Kylie had to be there in person to sign the admission of theft and the payment agreement. I hadn't seen her since that confrontation on the front porch, and walking into the conference room where she sat was jarring. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her hair wasn't styled the way it usually was for her Instagram photos, and she wore plain jeans and a sweater instead of designer clothes. She didn't have any makeup on, and her eyes were red like she'd been crying recently. When I sat down across the table from her, she stared at the papers in front of her instead of looking at me. Sandra sat beside her daughter with this expression that mixed disappointment and protectiveness in equal measure. Nadine laid out each document and explained what Kylie was signing. Kylie nodded at everything but never spoke. Her hand shook when she picked up the pen to sign the admission of theft. I watched her write her name on line after line, acknowledging what she'd done and agreeing to the payment terms. Sandra watched her daughter sign away any claim to Diane's money with tears running down her face. When everything was signed and notarized, Kylie stood up quickly and left the room without saying a single word to me. Sandra stayed behind for a moment and squeezed my hand. She thanked me for giving Kylie a chance to make this right instead of destroying her life with a criminal record. Then she followed her daughter out. The first payment arrived in my bank account exactly on schedule 3 days later. $6,000 from Sandra, plus Kylie's first $500 installment. I sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone screen showing the deposit confirmation. Then I transferred the money immediately into Diane's account and logged into her insurance portal to check medication costs. Her pain medication was only partially covered, and she'd been taking half doses to make it last longer. I called her pharmacy and ordered the full prescription at the proper dosage. That night, I gave Diane her medication at the correct amount for the first time in months. She fell asleep within an hour, and her face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen since before the chemo started. I sat beside her bed watching her sleep peacefully and felt satisfaction settle in my chest. The money was finally going where it should have been. All along. Chase texted me a week after the restitution agreement was signed. He said he was moving to a different gym across town and wanted me to know he was starting fresh. He thanked me for opening his eyes even though the truth had hurt him badly. He said he was going to be more careful about who he trusted from now on. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I typed out an apology for using him as a tool in my plan against Kylie. His reply came back after several minutes of silence. He said he understood why I did it, and that we'd both been collateral damage to Kylie's lies in different ways. He said he hoped Diane was getting better care now. I told him she was and thanked him for being decent about everything. We didn't message after that. I deleted his contact information and hoped he'd find someone honest. Diane had been sleeping better with the proper medication dosage for about 2 weeks when she had one of her more alert days. She sat up in bed without help and asked for breakfast instead of just drinking the nutrition shakes. I made her scrambled eggs and toast and sat with her while she ate slowly. When she finished, I told her about the restitution agreement and that money was returned for her care. She started crying immediately, but these tears looked different from the ones she'd cried when I first told her about Kylie's theft. She said she'd been so worried about leaving me with medical debt when she died. The relief in her voice made my throat tight. I told her we didn't need to think about that anymore, and that we should focus on making her comfortable. She reached for my hand and asked about her will and her wishes for what would happen after. We spent the next hour talking about practical things like funeral arrangements and what she wanted done with Paul's belongings. It was the clearest conversation we'd had in months. I went to my nursing supervisor the following week and asked about reducing to part-time hours. She understood immediately when I explained about Diane's condition and helped me fill out paperwork for family medical leave benefits that I didn't even know existed. Marlene had mentioned them weeks ago, but I'd been too overwhelmed to look into it. The financial strain of losing half my income was real and scary, but the returned money from Kylie helped cover some of Diane's expenses. Arthur started stopping by the house every few days to check on both of us. He'd bring groceries or just sit with Diane while I took a shower or ran errands. Marlene came over after her shifts and helped with medical tasks that were easier with two people. Their friendship became something I relied on completely during the exhausting routine of caregiving. I don't know how I would have managed those weeks without them. Kylie's second monthly payment showed up in my account right on time. Then the third payment arrived exactly when it was supposed to. I was surprised she was actually following through with the payment plan. Nadine called to check in and reminded me that Sandra was probably monitoring Kylie's compliance very closely. Each payment felt like a small acknowledgement of accountability, even though Kylie herself had never directly apologized to Diane or me beyond the legally required admission she'd signed. I deposited each payment and used the money for Diane's care exactly as intended. Better medications, medical supplies, a home health aide who came 3 times a week to help with bathing and physical therapy, things that would have been impossible before. 3 months after we signed the restitution agreement, Diane woke up one morning struggling to breathe. Her lips had a blue tint and she couldn't speak in full sentences. I called an ambulance and rode with her to the hospital holding her hand while the paramedics worked. The emergency room doctor said she had fluid in her lungs and her cancer had spread. They admitted her immediately. I was able to afford a private room instead of the shared rooms in the general ward. I paid extra for a comfortable chair that folded out into a bed so I could stay with her. I arranged for better pain management and additional comfort measures that weren't covered by her basic insurance. Sitting in that private room watching Diane rest peacefully with proper medication, I thought bitterly about how Kylie's theft could have meant Diane suffering in a crowded shared room with inadequate care. The anger I thought I'd moved past came, rushing back hot and sharp. I'd gotten the money back and Kylie was paying consequences, but it didn't erase what she'd done. It didn't erase the months when Diane had rationed her medication, or the fear she'd felt about leaving me in debt. The justice I'd fought for felt hollow sitting in that hospital room. Diane was still dying, and nothing I'd done to Kylie could change that. The hospital social worker caught me in the hallway outside Diane's room 3 days after she was admitted. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes who introduced herself and asked if I had support during this difficult time. I told her I had friends helping, but mostly I was managing alone. She handed me a flyer for a support group that met weekly at the community center, specifically for adult children caring for dying parents. I took the paper mostly to be polite, but that night sitting in the uncomfortable chair beside Diane's hospital bed, I actually read it. The meeting was Thursday evenings at 7. I went to the first one not knowing what to expect, and found myself in a circle of 12 people who all looked as exhausted as I felt. The facilitator asked us to share our situations if we were comfortable. A woman named Olivia talked about her father who had Alzheimer's, and how her brother had been stealing his Social Security checks for 2 years. A man named Robert described his mother's lung cancer, and how his sister convinced her to change her will while she was on heavy pain medication. Another woman shared that her uncle had taken out credit cards in her dying grandmother's name and maxed them out buying electronics. Story after story of family members treating illness as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. I sat there listening and feeling this strange mix of validation and horror. Kylie's theft wasn't unique or even particularly creative. It was almost commonplace among families dealing with terminal illness. When it was my turn, I told them about the $12,000 and the camera footage and the restitution agreement. Olivia nodded like she understood completely. Robert said he wished he'd been as proactive as me. The facilitator thanked me for sharing and said that financial exploitation during end-of-life care was far more common than people realized. Walking to my car after the meeting, I felt less alone in the complicated anger and grief. Other people understood what it was like to love someone who was dying while simultaneously fighting relatives who saw that dying person as a resource to exploit. Diane came home from the hospital on a Wednesday morning, and she looked smaller than when she'd gone in. The ambulance workers helped transfer her to the hospital bed I'd rented and set up in the living room because she couldn't manage stairs anymore. Her skin had this gray undertone that hadn't been there before, and her breathing sounded wet and labored even with the oxygen. That afternoon, her oncologist, Dr. Morrison, came by for a home visit. She sat on the edge of Diane's bed and took her hand gently. She said the cancer had spread to Diane's lungs and liver, and that aggressive treatment wasn't going to give her more quality time. She suggested we talk about hospice care to focus on comfort rather than cure. Diane looked at me with tears in her eyes, and I held her other hand while Dr. Morrison explained what hospice would provide. Nurses who specialized in end-of-life care, better pain management, equipment and supplies, someone available 24 hours a day to answer questions. Dr. Morrison said most patients preferred dying at home with hospice support rather than in a facility. I asked about cost, and she said Medicare covered most of it, but there would be some out-of-pocket expenses for additional comfort measures. I thought about the recovered money sitting in Diane's account, and felt grateful we had resources to pay for whatever she needed. After Dr. Morrison left, I helped Diane get comfortable with extra pillows and adjusted her oxygen. She asked me quietly if this meant she was dying soon. I told her honestly that Dr. Morrison thought it would be weeks or maybe a couple months. Diane nodded and said she was ready, that she was tired of fighting and just wanted to be comfortable. I called the hospice agency that afternoon, and they sent a nurse named Mary out that evening to do an intake assessment. By the end of the week, we had a care plan in place with nurses visiting 3 times a week and supplies delivered. I used the recovered funds to pay for overnight nursing support twice a week so I could actually sleep, and for a better mattress pad that helped prevent bed sores, and for the special nutritional drinks Diane could still swallow. Everything Kylie had stolen was going exactly where it should have all along. Paul's ex-wife called me on a Sunday afternoon 2 weeks after Diane came home from the hospital. Her name was Mary, and she'd never contacted me before in all the years since Paul died. She said she'd heard from Kylie that Diane wasn't doing well, and she wanted to know if Kylie could visit one last time. Her voice was careful and respectful, acknowledging that she understood if I said no. She promised she would supervise the entire visit and respect whatever boundaries I needed to set. I stood in the kitchen holding the phone and feeling torn in 2 directions. Part of me wanted to protect Diane from any more hurt or stress from Kylie, but another part recognized that Diane might want closure before she died, a chance to say goodbye to Paul's daughter despite everything that had happened. I told Mary I needed to think about it and talk to Diane first. Mary said she understood completely and gave me her number to call back. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time trying to figure out what was right. Marlene came over that evening and I told her about Sandra's call. Marlene asked what I thought Diane would want. I said honestly I didn't know. That. Diane was so hurt by the betrayal, but she also had this capacity for forgiveness that I didn't fully understand. Marlene suggested I just ask Diane directly during one of her lucid periods. She was right that Diane should make this choice herself. The next morning, Diane was having a good day, alert and mostly clear-headed despite the pain medication. I sat beside her bed and told her about Mary's call. Diane was quiet for what felt like a very long time, staring at the ceiling with tears sliding down her temples into her hair. Finally, she said yes. She wanted to see Kylie one more time. I asked if she was sure, and Diane nodded. She said she wanted to tell Kylie that she forgave her, but that Paul would have been disappointed in what she'd become. The grace in that response made my chest tight and my eyes burn. Diane was dying and still thinking about how to give Kylie one last chance at understanding the harm she'd caused. I told Diane I would arrange it, but there would be conditions. Mary would have to be there supervising, and Marlene would be there with me, and if Kylie caused any upset, the visit would end immediately. Diane agreed and squeezed my hand weakly. I called Mary back and we set it up for Saturday afternoon. Mary thanked me repeatedly and promised Kylie understood this was a privilege, not a right. I spent the rest of the week preparing myself emotionally for seeing Kylie again and hoping I could keep my anger in check for Diane's sake. Saturday afternoon arrived too quickly. Marlene came over early to help me get Diane comfortable and presentable. We brushed her hair and helped her into a clean nightgown and propped her up with pillows so she wasn't lying completely flat. Diane was anxious, picking at the blanket with her thin fingers and asking if she looked okay. I told her she looked beautiful and held her hand until the doorbell rang. Sandra arrived first, a slim woman in her 60s who looked at me with genuine apology in her eyes. She thanked me for allowing this and said Kylie was parking the car. Then Kylie walked in and I barely recognized her. She'd lost weight and wasn't wearing makeup, and her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked at Diane and her face crumpled immediately. She walked over to the bedside slowly like she was approaching something fragile. Marlene and I stood on one side while Sandra stood on the other. Kylie knelt beside the bed and started crying before she even said anything. Diane reached out with her oxygen tube dragging across the blanket and touched Kylie's face. She said in her weak, raspy voice that she forgave her for taking the money, but that stealing from family during crisis was a betrayal of everything Paul had valued. Kylie sobbed and said she was sorry over and over. She said she didn't know why she'd done it, that she'd been desperate and stupid and selfish. Diane told her that Paul would have been so disappointed to see what kind of person she'd become. Kylie's sobs got louder, and she put her head down on the bed next to Diane's hand. I watched this scene and couldn't tell if Kylie truly understood the harm she'd caused, or if she just felt guilty facing the consequences. Diane stroked Kylie's hair weakly, and told her she hoped she would become someone Paul could have been proud of. After about 15 minutes, Diane was clearly exhausted, and I said the visit needed to end. Kylie kissed Diane's forehead and whispered that she loved her. Sandra helped Kylie up and guided her toward the door. At the threshold, Kylie looked back at me and opened her mouth like she wanted to say something but then just left. Sandra thanked me again and followed her daughter out. After they left, I expected Diane to be upset or drained, but instead she seemed lighter somehow. She said she'd needed to do that, to release the burden of anger before she died. She told me she was proud of how I'd protected her and handled everything even though it had fractured the family. I sat on the edge of her bed and held her hand carefully because her skin was so thin now it bruised easily. I promised her that I would make sure her remaining time was as comfortable and peaceful as possible. Diane smiled and closed her eyes and fell asleep within minutes. Marlene helped me clean up the living room, and we sat together in the kitchen drinking tea. She asked how I was feeling, and I said I honestly didn't know. Seeing Kylie had brought back all the anger, but watching Diane forgive. Her had also shown me something about Grace I didn't fully understand. Marlene said forgiveness was complicated, and I didn't have to figure it all out right now. She was right, but I kept thinking about it anyway. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm of care and waiting. Kylie's monthly payments kept arriving right on schedule, and I deposited each one and used the money exactly as intended. I bought better pain medication that wasn't fully covered by insurance and paid for additional nursing visits when Diane needed more support. I hired a home health aide to come daily and help with bathing and changing sheets. I ordered special bed pads and lotions for her skin and a better oxygen concentrator that was quieter. Marlene came over almost every day after her nursing shifts and helped me create a peaceful environment. We put flowers on the table beside Diane's bed and played her favorite music softly. We printed photos from happier times and hung them where she could see them. Pictures of her and Paul on their wedding day, photos of me as a kid, images from vacations before cancer changed everything. Diane spent most of her time sleeping now, but in her brief alert moments, she would look at the photos and smile. Arthur stopped by regularly bringing groceries and sitting with Diane while I showered or rested. Their friendship had become something I relied on completely. The hospice nurses were kind and competent, showing me how to manage Diane's medications and what signs to watch for. They said she was comfortable, and that was what mattered most. Every night I slept in the recliner next to her bed so I could hear if she needed anything. The waiting was exhausting, but also precious in a strange way. These were our last days together, and I wanted to be present for all of them. Diane died on a Tuesday morning in early October. The hospice nurse had been there overnight and woke me just before dawn, saying Diane's breathing had changed. I moved to sit on the bed beside her and took her hand. Her breathing was shallow and irregular with long pauses between breaths. The nurse had given her medication to ease the transition, and Diane looked peaceful. I told her I loved her, and that it was okay to let go. Her hand was cold in mine. She took one more breath and then stopped. The silence felt enormous. The nurse checked for a pulse and said quietly that she was gone. I sat there holding Diane's hand and crying while the nurse made phone calls to the doctor and the funeral home. The grief hit like a physical weight crushing my chest, but mixed with it was relief that her suffering had ended. Marlene and Arthur arrived within an hour of my text. Marlene hugged me and cried with me while Arthur handled the practical details with the funeral home staff when they came. They helped me through those first numb hours of making decisions about arrangements and notifications. I was grateful they were there because I couldn't think clearly through the fog of grief. Planning Diane's funeral forced me to make decisions I didn't want to make. I had to choose between notifying Kylie or excluding her completely. I called Nadine for advice, and she said legally I had no obligation, but morally it might be the right thing to let her know. I also called two of Diane's closest friends from her teaching years, and they both said Diane would have wanted Kylie to have the chance to pay respects. So I sent a brief text message to the number Sandra had given me. I wrote that Diane had passed away and included the service details, but made it clear that any disruption would result in immediate removal. Sandra responded within an hour, thanking me for the notification and promising they would be respectful. I spent the next few days in a blur of arrangements, choosing a casket, writing an obituary, selecting readings and music, calling Diane's relatives and friends. Marlene stayed with me through most of it, making sure I ate and slept and didn't forget important details. Arthur handled logistics like parking and seating at the funeral home. Their support was the only thing keeping me functional. The funeral was on Friday afternoon at the small chapel Diane had attended occasionally. Maybe 40 people came, which felt right for someone whose world had shrunk during illness. Diane's friends from her teaching years sat in the front rows, women in their 60s and 70s who remembered her as vibrant and funny before cancer. Her former coworkers came, and neighbors from our street who'd watched her decline over 2 years. The hospice nurse Sandra attended, which touched me. I sat in the first row with Marlene and Arthur on either side of me. Kylie and her mother entered quietly and sat in the very back row. I saw them but didn't acknowledge them. The service was simple because that's what Diane had wanted. Her friend Margaret read a poem about gardens and growing things. Another friend shared memories of Diane's dedication to her students. I stood up and spoke briefly about her strength and grace even during the hardest times. My voice broke multiple times, but I got through it. After the service, people came through a receiving line to offer condolences. Kylie and Sandra left immediately without approaching me. I watched them walk out and felt relieved they'd come to pay respects, but hadn't tried to insert themselves into grief they'd complicated. The burial was private, just me and Marlene and Arthur at the cemetery. We stood in cold October wind while they lowered Diane's casket into the ground. I dropped a handful of dirt on top like you're supposed to and said goodbye one final time. Then we went home to the house that felt too empty without her hospital bed in the living room. 2 weeks after burying Diane, I found myself standing in her bedroom surrounded by cardboard boxes and piles of papers. The funeral home had sent final paperwork that needed filing. Going through her desk drawer, I found bank statements from the last 2 years, medical bills organized by date, and a manila folder labeled Important Documents in her careful handwriting. Inside was a life insurance policy from her teaching years that I never knew existed. The policy was small, just $15,000, but it was enough to cover the funeral costs with about $4,000 left over. Tucked inside the policy folder was a handwritten note on lined paper torn from a notebook. The handwriting was shaky but readable, dated 3 weeks before she died during one of her last truly clear days. My dear daughter, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're handling all the paperwork like I knew you would. Thank you for protecting me these last months. I knew something was wrong with my money, but I was too confused and tired to figure it out. I trusted you to notice and fix it. Use whatever's left for yourself. You gave up so much to take care of me. Love always, Mom. I sat on her bedroom floor holding that note and cried harder than I had since watching them lower her casket into the ground. The validation that she'd known something was wrong, that she'd trusted me to handle it, made everything I'd done feel necessary rather than vengeful. She'd wanted me to protect her, and I had, even when it meant destroying family relationships and manipulating people. The first of Kylie's monthly payments arrived 3 days later, $500 deposited directly into the account I'd set up for restitution. Seeing that money appear after Diane was already gone felt strange and uncomfortable. The payments were supposed to help with her care, to replace what Kylie had stolen during treatment. Now they were just money with no clear purpose. I stared at the bank balance for 20 minutes, trying to decide what to do with funds that felt dirty somehow, tainted by their origin, even though recovering them had been the whole point. I called Nadine the next day and explained my confusion about the continuing payments. She suggested setting up a separate account specifically for the restitution money and deciding later how to use it in a way that would honor Diane's memory. After thinking it through, I opened a new savings account and had all of Kylie's payments redirected there. The money could go toward cancer patient support services or help other families dealing with financial exploitation during illness. Using it for something good felt better than spending it on myself or letting it sit in an account reminding me of everything that happened. Kylie's second payment arrived right on schedule, then the third. I barely looked at the statements anymore, just filed them away and tried to focus on sorting through Diane's belongings and figuring out what came next for my own life. 3 months after the funeral, I came home from a nursing shift to find actual mail waiting in my box instead of the usual bills and advertisements. The envelope had my name and address written in unfamiliar handwriting. Number. Return address. But the postmark was local. Inside was a handwritten letter on nice stationery, 3 pages covered in the same careful script from the envelope. It was from Kylie. She started by saying she knew I probably didn't want to hear from her, and she'd understand if I threw the letter away without reading it. Then she wrote about being in therapy twice a week for the last 2 months, working with someone who specialized in understanding destructive behavior patterns. She talked about facing the reality of what she'd done, stealing from a dying woman who'd only ever tried to be kind to her after her father died. The letter acknowledged that apologies couldn't undo the harm or bring back the time Diane spent rationing medication because of money Kylie had taken. But she wanted me to know she was taking real responsibility for becoming someone capable of such cruelty. The therapist was helping her understand how she'd justified the theft to herself, how she'd developed patterns of using people for money, how losing her dad had twisted into feeling entitled to whatever she could take. The last page talked about making actual changes, not just saying sorry. She'd gotten a job at a retail store, was living with her mother to save money for paying off debts, had deleted all her social media accounts about life coaching. She wrote that she understood if I never wanted contact with her again, that she'd destroyed any right to family connection. But she hoped I'd believe she was genuinely trying to become someone different, someone who would never exploit vulnerable people again. The letter felt more real than any of her previous attempts at reconciliation, less focused on getting forgiveness, and more on acknowledging exactly what she'd done wrong. I put the letter in my desk drawer and didn't respond immediately. The idea of forgiving Kylie or rebuilding any relationship felt impossible and exhausting. I showed the letter to Marlene during one of our weekly dinners at her house. She read it carefully while I picked at the pasta she'd made, then set it down and looked at me with that thoughtful expression she got when she was choosing words carefully. Marlene said forgiveness wasn't really about deciding Kylie deserved to be absolved of what she'd done. It was about releasing the anger that had been eating at me for months, the constant fury that colored everything, even now that Diane was gone. Whether Kylie changed or stayed terrible didn't actually affect my life anymore unless I let it. I could choose to stop carrying the weight of hating her without that meaning we had to have a relationship, or that what she did was okay. The conversation made sense intellectually, but emotionally, I wasn't ready to let go of the anger yet. It felt like the anger was all I had left of the fight to protect Diane. I kept the letter instead of throwing it away, though, which felt like a small step towards something even if I didn't know what. 6 months after Diane died, Kylie's final restitution payment arrived in the dedicated account. 12 monthly payments of $500 plus the initial $6,000 from her mother meant the full $12,000 had been returned. The payment came with a brief note from Kylie's mother, thanking me for giving her daughter the chance to make amends through structured accountability instead of going to prison. She wrote that she believed the payment plan had actually helped Kylie more than criminal charges would have, forcing her to face the consequences consistently over time while working to become more responsible. I acknowledged to myself, sitting there looking at the completed payment record, that the woman was probably right. The monthly payments had created ongoing accountability that jail time might not have provided. But I also knew my motivation hadn't been about Kylie's rehabilitation. I'd wanted the money back for Diane's care, and I'd wanted Kylie to face consequences. That it might have helped her become better was accidental rather than intentional. Still, the structured approach had worked better than I'd expected when Nadine first suggested it. I finally responded to Kylie's letter in late July, 7 months after Diane's death. I kept my note brief and honest rather than trying to pretend feelings I didn't have. I wrote that I acknowledged her efforts at accountability and appreciated that she was apparently taking therapy seriously and making real changes. But I made clear that rebuilding any form of relationship would take years if it happened at all, and I wasn't making any promises about future contact. I told her that I hoped her therapy helped her become someone who wouldn't exploit vulnerable people, and that the best amends she could make to Diane's memory was ensuring she never did this to anyone else. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, more like releasing some of the constant anger that Marlene had talked about. I mailed the note and felt lighter somehow, like I'd set down a heavy bag I'd been carrying. The memorial fund took shape in August. Using the recovered restitution money combined with the few thousand left from Diane's life insurance, I worked with the local cancer support center to establish a fund in her name. The Diane Peterson Patient Assistance Fund would specifically help cancer patients with costs that insurance didn't cover, the kind of expenses Diane had struggled with while Kylie was stealing from her. Transportation to treatment appointments, medication copays, medical equipment rentals, home care supplies. The center's coordinator walked me through the setup process and seemed genuinely moved by the story behind the fund. Turning something so terrible into something that would help other families felt like the right way to honor Diane's memory. It wouldn't bring her back or erase what happened, but it would prevent other patients from suffering the way she had. I returned to full-time nursing work in September, picking up the schedule I'd had before reducing hours for Diane's care. The first few weeks back were exhausting as I readjusted to the physical demands and long shifts, but I noticed something unexpected as I settled back into the routine. My experience as Diane's caregiver had changed how I approached my job in ways I hadn't anticipated. I found myself more patient with difficult family dynamics, more willing to spend extra time explaining care options to confused relatives. I recognized signs of potential elder abuse that I might have missed before, small things like family members being overly controlling about finances or patients seeming nervous around certain visitors. During one shift, I spent an extra hour talking with an elderly patient's daughter who seemed overwhelmed by coordinating care while working full-time, and I could hear my own experience in her exhaustion and guilt. I became more committed to advocating for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves, speaking up in care meetings about ensuring adequate pain management, and questioning decisions that seemed more about convenience than patient comfort. Diane's situation had taught me things I desperately wished I'd never had to learn, but those lessons made me better at helping other people navigate similar crises. Chase contacted me out of nowhere in October through a text message that started with an apology for reaching out after so long. He said he wanted me to know he was engaged to someone new, a woman, named Brianna, who worked at the gym and had supported him through the breakup with Kylie. They'd been friends for years before the relationship developed into something more. Chase wrote that despite how painful everything had been with discovering Kylie's lies and theft, he was grateful he'd learned those lessons before making bigger commitments to the wrong person. Meeting someone honest and kind after experiencing manipulation had made him appreciate the difference. His happiness felt like one genuinely good outcome from the whole mess. I texted back congratulating him and thanking him for letting me know. 1 year after Diane died, I was finally ready to sort through the last boxes of her belongings that I'd been avoiding. Most of her clothes had gone to donation months ago, her medical equipment returned, her furniture either kept or sold. But I'd left several boxes of personal items unopened in the spare room, not ready to face the final pieces of her life. On a cold Saturday in November, I made myself go through them. Photo albums from her teaching years, cards from former students, her collection of gardening books, costume jewelry she'd loved. In the bottom of the last box, I found a journal with a fabric cover that I'd never seen before. The entries started 2 years ago right after her diagnosis and continued sporadically through her treatment. Most were short notes about symptoms or appointment schedules, but some were longer reflections about being sick and scared. I read through it slowly, crying at her descriptions of pain and confusion, smiling at memories she'd recorded about good days. About halfway through the journal, I found entries about Kylie. Diane had written that she was worried something was wrong with her bank account, but the chemo made it hard to keep track of money. She noted feeling confused about having less cash than she expected and finding receipts she didn't remember. Then an entry from 8 months before she died. I think Kylie might be taking money from my wallet, but I can't tell if that's real or if I'm just confused from the medication. I'm too tired to investigate. I hope my daughter notices if something is really wrong. I trust her to protect me if I can't protect myself. Reading those words validated everything I'd done over the last year. She had suspected. She had trusted me to notice and handle it. She had wanted me to protect her when she couldn't do it herself. The guilt I'd been carrying about my methods, about manipulating Chase and destroying Kylie's fake business and forcing the restitution agreement, all of it eased knowing I'd done exactly what Diane had hoped I would do. I put the journal back in the box and sat on the floor of the spare room for a long time, holding that validation close. The anniversary of Diane's death arrived on a gray Tuesday in October, and I spent the morning at her grave with flowers and coffee like we used to share on her good days. When I got home, there was a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. Kylie's mother's voice came through hesitant and careful, saying she didn't want to intrude but thought I should know that Kylie had been volunteering at a senior center for the past 6 months. She worked there twice a week helping with activities and had gotten a steady job at a retail store downtown. The therapy was continuing, and Kylie was building what her mother called a more honest life. She made it clear she wasn't asking for reconciliation or contact, just wanted me to know on this difficult anniversary that Kylie was trying to become better. I listened to the message 3 times, feeling complicated things I couldn't quite name. I texted back a brief thank you for the update and said I appreciated knowing Kylie was working on herself, but our paths didn't need to cross. The boundary felt important to maintain even while acknowledging the information. The cancer center called a few days later, asking if I could come in to see something related to Diane's memorial fund. When I arrived, the social worker led me to a conference room where she'd spread out thank you notes and photos from 15 different patients who had received help in the fund's first year. Transportation costs for an elderly man who couldn't drive to radiation appointments. Medication copays for a single mother whose insurance wouldn't cover the full amount. A wig for a teenage girl who'd lost her hair. Heating bill assistance for a retired teacher. Going through treatment in winter. Each note had a face and a story, people who'd been spared some of the suffering Diane endured because Kylie's restitution money had gone exactly where it should have. I sat looking at those photos and realized this was the justice that actually mattered. Not Kylie's punishment or my revenge, but preventing other families from experiencing what we went through. The social worker told me the fund had already helped more people than she'd expected, and asked if I'd consider speaking at their annual donor event about why I'd established it. I agreed, thinking Diane would want her story to mean something beyond just our family's pain. At the caregiver support group that Thursday, a new member joined who'd lost his father to lung cancer while dealing with his brother stealing from the estate. His name was Noah, and he had this exhausted look I recognized from my own mirror during Diane's final months. We ended up talking after the meeting about the complicated anger that comes with grief and betrayal mixed together. He understood without me having to explain why certain things triggered me, or why I sometimes felt guilty about the methods I'd used to protect Diane. Over the next few months, we started meeting for coffee outside the group sessions, both of us taking things slowly because we were carrying wounds that needed careful handling. There was comfort in being with someone who didn't need long explanations about why family betrayal hits different from regular grief. Noah had his own version of my story with different details but the same core of violation and protective rage. We went to movies and walked in parks and talked about our parents in ways that honored them, while acknowledging the messy reality of what their illnesses had revealed about family dynamics. 2 years after I first noticed those weird withdrawals on Diane's bank statements, I was building something that looked like an actual life again. The restitution money had gone exactly where it should have, funding care for people who needed it, and establishing a memorial that would help families long after Kylie's payments ended. Kylie had faced real consequences and was apparently working on becoming a better person, though I had no desire to witness that transformation personally. I'd found purpose in helping other families navigate similar crises through the support group and occasional speaking engagements about elder abuse prevention. My relationship with Noah was growing into something genuine and careful, both of us learning to trust again after betrayal. It wasn't a neat resolution where everything was perfectly healed and forgiveness flowed freely. The anger still surfaced sometimes when I thought about Diane rationing her pain medication, or being shaken awake by someone demanding money. But the rage that had consumed me during her final months had transformed into something more useful, focused on preventing future harm rather than perfect punishment for past wrongs. The justice I'd achieved was messy and complicated and real, built on restitution and accountability rather than revenge, and somehow that felt more authentic than any tidy ending could have been.